The vial was cold in her palm, no larger than a finger, stopped with wax the color of old ivory. Outside the dressing room door, 300 guests waited for the wedding supper to begin. Inside, Cecily Vane stood at the dressing table of the new Countess of Ashmore and made the only choice she had ever made that was entirely her own. She set the vial down. She picked up the other. She had arrived at Ashmore Park 6 weeks before Christmas. Hired by letter, her references impeccable, her purpose understood by no one in the household except herself. A companion, they said. A support to Lady Ashmore through her first difficult season as a new bride. The Dowager Countess had written the letter herself, and Cecily had read it twice before she understood what was being asked of her, and a third time before she admitted she had understood it the first time. 30 guineas upon arrival, another 30 when the marriage was dissolved. The sum was more than her father had left in total. She had told herself she had no choice, which was the thing a person told herself when she had already made one, and yet here she stood. The vial with the draught that would produce a convincing illness, a prolonged weakness, a visible and heart-breaking decline, the physicians would attribute to fragility and poor constitution set carefully aside. The second vial, the one she had carried in her own bag all the way from London, the simple tincture her mother had used for seasickness, harmless and bitter and completely without consequence, held now between her thumb and her forefinger over the Countess's evening tisane. She tipped it in. She stirred it with the glass rod provided for exactly that purpose, and she set the cup back in its saucer, and she stood very still in the lamplight and waited to understand what she had done. The Countess of Ashmore did not know what had been intended for her. She did not know that the companion engaged to ease her into her new life had arrived carrying instructions from her mother-in-law. She did not know that the Dowager had decided some months before the wedding that her son had made an unfortunate attachment to a woman of insufficient fortune and insufficient bloodline, and that the marriage, however legal, might still be rendered temporary by a variety of means, the gentlest of which was a sustained and medically credible withdrawal from society on the Countess's part, leading to a quiet retreat to a cousin's house in Devonshire, leading eventually to a separation that everyone would describe as tragic and no one would describe as designed. She did not know any of it. She was a woman of 24 named Margaret, and she had kind eyes and a small laugh, and she worked very hard at being the wife that Ashmore Park required her to be, and she sometimes stood at the long gallery window in the evenings and looked out at the grounds with an expression Cecily had recognized, after the third time she saw it, as loneliness. Cecily knew loneliness. She was 26 years old, and she had been knowing it for 5 years since the winter. Her father's business had dissolved, and her mother had died, and the world in which she had been raised had folded quietly shut around its debts, like a letter put away. She had been a companion before. She had been employed by women who were kind, and by women who were indifferent, and once by a woman who had made her feel for 11 months that she was invisible, that her presence in the room was a domestic fact, like a curtain or a fire screen, rather than an evidence of a human being. She had endured. She had learned the particular grammar of endurance. The lowered gaze, the slight step back, the opinion unvoiced, the name corrected from Miss Vane to Vane with no prefix, as though the season had decided she had no claim to the ordinary courtesies. To the household at Ashmore Park, she was just a companion, nothing more. She had heard it said on her third day in the corridor outside the breakfast room, in the Dowager's voice, carrying without effort through the half-open door. Lady Ashmore's new companion, Vane. Nothing to concern yourself with. A companion and nothing more. The words had landed on Cecily in the flat way that things landed when one had learned to expect them, and she had straightened her spine and continued toward the breakfast room, and she had not allowed her face to say anything at all. She had thought she would be equal to the task. She had needed the money. She had told herself that the Countess would be well, that the draft was mild, that the Dowager had said nothing would cause permanent harm, that a temporary illness was not a destruction. She had told herself many things. She had been telling herself things for 6 weeks. What she had not expected was the gardens. Lady Ashmore had walked with her in the kitchen gardens on the fourth morning, pointing out the plants she meant to restore when spring came, naming them in Latin and in the local dialect both. Her gloved hands moving with a quick pleasure she was not yet comfortable expressing anywhere else on the estate. What she had not expected was the count of small kindnesses. The cup of tea set beside Cecily at the writing desk without comment, the shawl left on the chair nearest the fire, the book of verse pressed into her hands because, "I thought you might like this. It has rather melancholy poems, and I think you are a woman who likes melancholy poems," said in the tone of someone who was trying to be a friend and was not quite certain of the protocol. What she had not expected most of all was Lord Ashmore. He was 34 years old, and he had the reserve of a man who had learned to hold himself at a considered distance from enthusiasm, as though hope were a thing he had once extended too fully and been declined. His face was a study in containing itself, a long jaw, gray eyes that catalogued a room from the doorway before he entered it, a mouth that did not smile easily, and when it did, seemed surprised by the fact. He spoke little. He did not perform ease. He had the kind of stillness that was not vacancy, but attention. The stillness of a man who is listening for something he was not certain he had the right to hope would be said. He had noticed Cecily on the second day. Not in the way she was accustomed to being noticed, the quick recalibration of a man who sees a woman of uncertain status and categorizes her accordingly, but in the way a man noticed something that did not fit a pattern he had constructed. She had been reading to the Countess in the sitting room, her voice steady and low, and she had looked up at the pause in the doorway and found his gaze on her with an expression she had not yet learned to name. He had said, "Miss Vane." A correct acknowledgement. He had not said what he was looking for. She had said, "My lord," and returned to the page. He had remained in the doorway for a moment longer than the acknowledgement required. She had been careful not to look up again. The weeks had compounded. She had watched him with his wife, and she had seen a man who was trying, not effortlessly, and not naturally, but with a patient and deliberate effort, to learn the specific language of this woman he had married. She had watched Lady Ashmore trying in return, the two of them navigating the peculiar early geography of a marriage, not yet warm, careful with each other in the way of people who were afraid to make an error. And she had thought, against her will and more than once, that they might manage it, that if the machinery around them would simply let them alone, they might in time arrive at something real. If you found yourself hoping for their happiness, she thought, as she stood in the dressing room with the harmless tincture dissolving into the tisane, then you had already lost the argument with yourself. You had lost it weeks ago, probably. You had lost it in the kitchen garden with the Latin names of the herbs, or the afternoon by the fire with the melancholy poems, or the morning she had seen him look at his wife across the breakfast table with an expression that he shuddered immediately upon meeting Cecily's eyes, the expression of a man who was quietly deciding something. She was a companion and nothing more. The household had decided it. The dowager had built her entire plan upon it. She picked up the cup and saucer and carried it to the outer room. If you are still with Cecily in that dressing room, still holding your breath, leave your thoughts below, because this story has only just turned on its fulcrum. Lady Ashmore drank the tisane without looking at it, her attention on the mirror and the small adjustments her maid was making to the coronet of pearls. She said, "Is it all right?" meaning the tisane. Cecily said, "I believe so," which was true in every sense she could now claim. Lady Ashmore said, "I think this evening will be dreadful," and Cecily said, "I think you will manage it beautifully," which was not something a companion and nothing more was typically expected to say, but which seemed to her to be accurate, and the Countess looked at her in the mirror with a small startled gratitude and said, which was the first time she had used her first name, and which landed somewhere in Cecily's chest with more weight than she was prepared for. She left the Countess to her maid, and went downstairs by the back stairs, and stood for a moment in the corridor that ran behind the east drawing-room, in the smell of beeswax and the cold that came under the exterior door, and she thought about what would happen next. The dowager would expect a result. She had been patient, which was to say she had not demanded a report. But patience in a woman of Lady Serena Ashmore's character, was a form of pressure, not an absence of it. She had made 3 visits to Cecily's room in 6 weeks, each framed as a social call, each structured as a progress inquiry. The most recent had been 4 days prior. She had sat in the single armchair and arranged her skirts, and said, "I hope matters are developing as planned," in the tone one used with a servant who had been given clear instructions. Cecily had said, "I believe they are," which she had intended at the time as reassurance, and which she now understood as the last lie she had been willing to tell. The dinner was announced. She took her place at the far end of the table, in the position that had been arranged for her, not at the family end, not at the servants' end, but in that particular intermediate territory reserved for women of her station, near enough to be available, far enough to be invisible. She ate her soup. She listened to the conversation. She kept her expression composed. Lord Ashmore was at the head of the table, his wife at his right, the dowager at his left, and the arrangement struck Cecily, watching from her careful remove as a physical diagram of the contest being conducted every day in this house. She watched the dowager address a remark past Lady Ashmore as though she were a piece of furniture imperfectly placed. She watched Lady Ashmore absorb the slight with a steadiness that was costing her something. She watched his hand tighten briefly on the stem of his glass. He noticed her noticing. Their eyes met the length of the table, and she looked away first, and the soup was replaced with the fish, and the evening continued. She catalogued the dinner in the manner she had learned to catalogue things she could not otherwise act upon. The dowager's method was patient and architectural. A remark about the neighbor's eldest daughter that placed Lady Ashmore's own situation in unfavorable contrast, delivered with a smile that did not reach the fan. A gentle redirection of the conversation whenever he addressed his wife directly, so that the flow of the table ran always through the dowager's territory. A word to the footman that bypassed Lady Ashmore's authority as hostess without technically overriding it. It was expert work. It was the work of decades. And Lady Ashmore, who was 24 and had been mistress of this house for 3 months, absorbed each small displacement with a grace that was costing her rather more than it appeared, the set of her shoulders very slightly too controlled, the smile that arrived a half-second after it should have. Cecily looked at her own plate. She understood now, with a clarity that had not been available to her in October, when she had read the dowager's letter, why the commission had seemed necessary. Lady Ashmore was not weak. She was simply new, and the dowager had calculated that new things given sufficient pressure could be made to break along their seams. It was not a villainous calculation. It was the calculation of a woman who understood what she was protecting and had not yet encountered something she could not manage. She had not in the full account calculated correctly. Cecily had seen her at work tonight, and she understood with a new and uncomfortable precision that refusing the commission had not ended anything. It had only changed the terms. After supper, the household retired to the music room. The fire had been built up. One of the neighboring ladies sat down at the pianoforte, and the sound filled the room with the particular warmth that music gave to cold houses in winter. And Cecily stood near the window, and held a glass of Madeira she was not drinking, and waited for the dowager to find her. She found her within 20 minutes. She was a woman in her late 50s. With excellent posture and eyes the color of flint, and she moved through a room as though the room had been designed to receive her specifically. She stopped beside Cecily at the window and did not look at her directly. She said, "I understand my daughter-in-law is in good health this evening." Cecily said, "She is quite well, my lady." The dowager said, "I expected to see some sign of decline before Christmas." Cecily looked at her glass. She said, "I have found it difficult to proceed." There was a silence. The pianoforte played something bright and unconcerned. The dowager said, "You were given instructions, Vane. That is all you are here for. A useful pair of hands and nothing more." Cecily turned to look at her. It was the first time in 6 weeks that she had looked at her directly and held the look. She said, "I do not believe I will be completing the commission." The dowager's expression went through several adjustments in rapid succession, the last of which was a controlled and cold fury. far more dangerous than anything louder would have been. She said quietly, "You understand what I can do to your reputation. A companion without a character reference does not find another position." Cecily said, "I understand." The dowager said, "Then you understand. You have made yourself unemployable with a single evening sentimentality." She said it with the particular confidence of someone who had never in her life had to calculate whether the money in her account would last the winter. Cecily said, "I expect so," and turned back to the room. The dowager left. Cecily stood at the window and held her Madeira, and looked at the fire, and experienced the precise sensation of having done something irreversible. It was not comfortable. It was not warm. It was, she thought, accurate. She had been inaccurate for long enough. She did not tell him that evening. She did not tell him the next morning. She sat with the knowledge for 2 days through the remaining house party and into the quiet that followed when the guests had departed, and she composed and discarded a dozen interior addresses on the subject. And none of them were right, because the correct thing to say was also the thing that would end her tenure at Ashmore Park and return her to London with no reference in the 30 guineas that had already been spent on winter clothes. She lay awake the first night, listening to the wind come off the moor, and thought about alternatives, which was the habit of a woman who had spent 5 years finding the door in every room. There was no door. She had closed the commission. She could not unclose it without being the kind of person she had already decided not to be. She could not remain silent while the dowager believed the plan was still in progress. That deception had a natural end, and it would arrive at the worst possible moment. She could not write to the dowager and simply report that she had changed her mind, because changed minds were not in the contract, and the dowager would find another instrument, which would be worse than the one Cecily herself had been. She had one option, which was to tell the truth to the person who most needed to have it. She had been in his library that first week, shelving a volume he had left in the drawing room, and she had looked at the titles and understood something about him from the pattern of them, the kind of man who ordered books. Not for display, but because the things they contained were the things he actually thought about. She had stood in his library for a few minutes longer than the errand required, running her finger along the spines in the firelight, and she had thought, in a way she could not fully control, that she would like to know what he thought of the arguments in the 3rd volume on the 2nd shelf. She had put the thought away. She had returned to the drawing room. She had done this several times in the week since, and she would continue doing it because there was no alternative, and there was no door, and she had made her peace with that the way she had made her peace with everything, one quiet morning at a time. What she had not calculated was Lord Ashmore himself. He found her in the library on the 3rd day after the party in the late morning, when she was returning a volume to its shelf. She had not heard him enter. She was aware of him, as she was always aware of him, which was immediately and precisely, the way a person knew where a candle was in a dark room without looking directly at it. She turned. He said, "Miss Vane." "I would like to speak with you," she said. "Of course, my lord." And she set the book on the shelf and turned to face him and waited. He said, "I want you to tell me what my mother hired you to do." She had not prepared for directness. She had prepared for circumlocution, for maneuver, for the long approach. She had not prepared for the simple question asked in that level voice, looking at her as though she had the answer, and he intended to have it. She said, "How did you know?" He said, "I have known my mother a long time. I understand the shape of her interventions. What I did not know was the specific instrument." He paused. "And then I began to watch you. And the instrument was not behaving as my mother's instruments typically behave. She thought about the tisane in the dressing room. She thought about the morning in the kitchen garden. She thought about the pianoforte still carrying a phrase from the Christmas party, which was not quite true, but felt so. She told him. She told him plainly and without softening. She told him about the letter, and the 30 guineas, and the vial, and the dressing room, and what she had done instead. She told him about the 2nd vial, the innocuous one from her own bag, and the tincture dissolved into the tisane. She did not tell him how she had arrived at the decision, because she was not certain she could explain it in terms that were not about him, and those were terms she was not prepared to use. He listened. He did not interrupt. He stood very still with his hands at his sides, and she could not read him. Could read nothing in his face except the particular contained quality she had learned to recognize as his way of feeling something he was not yet ready to name. When she was finished, he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Why?" She said, "Because your wife is a good woman, and she does not deserve what was intended for her." He said, "And what about what was intended for you?" She said, "I beg your pardon." He said, "You have given up your position. You have refused a commission. You have no reference from this household." He said it not as a rebuke, but as an inventory, methodical and unsparing, the way he did everything. She said, "I was aware of the consequences." He said, "I do not think you were quite." She said, "My lord, I understand the situation I have put myself in." He said, "You have put yourself in a situation where you performed an act of considerable courage on behalf of my wife and received nothing for it. That is not a situation I intend to leave unaddressed," she said, carefully. "I did not do it to be addressed." He said, "I know." He said it the way he said things, direct, without performance. He said, "Miss Vane, I am going to have to ask you a number of very direct questions about what was in each vial, and exactly what you substituted, because I am going to need to speak with the physician, and then I am going to need to speak with my solicitor, and then I am going to have a very careful conversation with my mother." He said, "I am also going to ask you to remain at Ashmore Park for the present, not as my mother's agent, but as my wife's companion, in fact with a proper letter and a proper wage." She looked at him. She said, "You cannot want me to stay. I came here to harm your wife." He said, "You came here under false employment and corrected the only decision in your power to correct when the real one mattered." He said, "That is not nothing." She stood in the library with the row of spines behind her, and the morning light coming through the tall windows and the fire low on the hearth, and she was aware of how close they were standing, which was closer than they should have been, which was the distance at which she could see the exact shade of his eyes, and the tension across his jaw, and the quality of the silence before he had decided what to say next. She said, "My lord, I appreciate what you are offering. I think you should speak with Lady Ashmore before you make any such arrangement." He said, "I intend to." He did not step back. She said, "I may not be the companion she would choose, knowing what I know about myself." He said, "She will choose you." He said it with a certainty that struck her as either arrogance or a very precise knowledge of his wife, and she had been watching him long enough to know it was the latter. He stepped back, then restoring the proper distance between them, and the room came back to its full dimensions, and she became aware again that she was a companion in a great house, and not a woman whose inner workings were anyone's concern. He said, "I will speak with Lady Ashmore this afternoon." He said, "Will you stay for the present?" She said, "Yes, my lord." He said, "Good," and left. She stood in the library for a long time after he was gone. She held her hands together and looked at the shelves and thought about what had just occurred, and was careful not to draw any conclusions from it, because the conclusions available to her were not conclusions she had the right to draw. Lady Ashmore sought her out before supper. She came to Cecily's room herself without her maid, and she sat on the edge of the chair by the window, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "James told me what you were hired to do." Cecily said, "Yes." Lady Ashmore said, "And what you did instead." Cecily said, "Yes." There was a silence. Outside, the winter had settled into a deep and even cold, and the light was already going at 4 in the afternoon. Lady Ashmore said, "I want to ask you why, and I want you to tell me truthfully." Cecily said, "Because you walked me through the kitchen gardens and you knew all the Latin names, and you left a shawl on my chair because you noticed I was cold, and I thought you were worth more than what was planned for you." She had not intended to say it quite like that. It was too direct for a companion and nothing more. Lady Ashmore was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "I should like you to stay, if you are willing." Cecily said, "His lordship asked the same." Lady Ashmore said, "He did not surprise you." Cecily said, "He did not." Lady Ashmore looked at her with something in her expression that Cecily could not entirely read. It was not suspicion. It was something more calibrated than that. A woman making an assessment and arriving at a conclusion she was deciding whether to act on. She said, "We had better be honest with one another, I think." "It will make things considerably easier," Cecily said. "I agree." Lady Ashmore said, "You love my husband." The room was very quiet. The cold outside pressed against the glass. Cecily said after a moment, "I hold him in the very highest regard." Lady Ashmore said, "That is not what I said." Cecily said, "I know what you said." Lady Ashmore was silent. She looked at her hands, which were folded in her lap, and then she looked up and said, "He is a good man. He is a better man than the season gave him credit for being, and a better man than he believes himself to be. I am trying very hard to be the wife he deserves, and I find it is rather slow work, because he was hurt a long time ago, and he has not finished deciding whether to put it down." She paused. "I am telling you this, because you are honest with me, and because I think you already know it, and because I find it easier to speak plainly than to speak around things." Cecily said, "I know." Lady Ashmore said, "It would be simpler if you went." Cecily said, "Yes?" Lady Ashmore said, "But I do not want you to go." She said it with the same honest directness with which she had said everything else, which was the quality in her that had undone Cecily's commission in the first place. She said, "I am telling you that I know what I am asking you to manage, and I am asking you to manage it, because I think you are a woman of sufficient character to manage it well." Cecily said, "I will not betray your trust." Lady Ashmore said, "I know that too. Otherwise I would not be in this room." They sat together for a few minutes in the gathering dark, which was an unusual thing for a countess and a companion, and nothing more to do. And then Lady Ashmore stood and smoothed her skirt and said, "Supper in an hour. I think we ought to dress." The dowager was a different matter. He conducted the interview with his mother 2 days after Christmas, in the study, with the door closed, and Cecily knew nothing of its contents except the reverberations she felt in the household afterward. There was a new temperature in the corridors, a careful stillness in the way the senior servants carried themselves, and the dowager herself, who appeared at dinner that evening, with a face arranged in the neutral expression of a woman who is recalculating. She did not speak to Cecily directly. For 4 days, on the 5th day, she stopped her in the gallery. She said, "You understand that what you did was a considerable interference." Cecily said, "Yes, my lady." The dowager said I had designed a situation that was orderly and had a clean resolution. Cecily said, "I understand." The dowager looked at her with those flint-colored eyes and said, "You are not what I hired." Cecily said, "No, my lady, I am not," the dowager said, vain. "A companion and nothing more." She said it quietly, and without the original dismissal. She said it as though she were repeating the classification, allowed to discover whether it still held. She looked at Cecily for a moment in silence. Then she said, "I understand my son has offered you a permanent position." Cecily said, "He has discussed it." The dowager said, "I will not interfere with it." Whiz. She said it flatly, as a statement of policy rather than a concession. She said, "I will not interfere with the marriage, either. I find I have reached the natural limit of what interference can accomplish." Cecily said, "I believe so, my lady." The dowager said, "Good evening," and walked away. It was not warmth, it was not forgiveness. It was the posture of a woman who had run a plan into its evidence, and found the evidence uncongenial, and who was adjusting with the dignity she applied to all reversals. Cecily did not expect more from her, and she did not receive more. And in the month that followed they existed in the household at a careful remove that was not hostility, but was not friendship, which was Cecily thought. Sufficient. By February, Ashmore Park had found a new rhythm. Lady Ashmore had begun corresponding with a botanist in Edinburgh about the kitchen garden. He had replaced the steward his mother had installed 3 years prior with one of his own choosing. The house breathed differently than it had done in the weeks of the house party, more openly, as though a window had been pushed up that had been stuck a long time. Cecily's position was, on paper, exactly as it had been. Companion to the Countess. £30 per annum. The room at the end of the east corridor. With the window that looked toward the stables in practice, it was something harder to categorize. She dined with the family as a matter of course. She walked with Lord and Lady Ashmore in the grounds when the weather permitted. She read in the evenings, in the sitting room while the fire burned and the Countess worked on her correspondence, and he was present in that particular way, not talking much, not needing to. The sitting room in February had a smell she came to associate with safety. Beeswax and the particular cold that came off old stone walls even in a heated room, the faint char of the fire, and some undefinable quality of stillness that meant everyone present had accepted where they were. Lady Ashmore hummed sometimes without appearing to notice it, small snatches of melody that came and went while she wrote. He had the habit in the evenings of leaving whatever book he was reading open on the arm of the chair and looking at the fire for a few minutes before returning to it, as though the fire contained something worth consulting. Cecily had her chair by the window and she read, and the room carried on around her with the easy continuance of a thing that had been doing so for a long time, though in fact it had only been doing so for 6 weeks, which was the speed at which ordinary comfort built itself when it was allowed to. She was careful. She had made a promise in a way that had no words. She had made it in the dressing room with the 2 vials, had confirmed it in Lady Ashmore's room with the gathering dark, and she kept it with the same steadiness with which she had kept every charge she had been given, except this one was freely chosen and cost nothing. She regretted. There were moments, there were always moments, which was the thing about living in close quarters, with a man you had made a private decision about. The moments accumulated in the way that certain small debts accumulated, quietly and without apparent notice, until the accounting was rather more substantial than expected. His voice across the breakfast table. The evening he had found her in the library with the wrong book for the mood she was in and had, without comment, set the correct one beside her and left. The afternoon in the garden when he had held the gate open and she had passed through and the pause before the gate closed was perhaps a second longer than necessary. She did not mark them. She did not save them. She noted them the way one noted the weather, and went inside. In March, Lady Ashmore fell ill with a genuine winter cold, nothing serious, but enough to confine her to her rooms for 4 days, and reduce the household's activities to those that could be conducted quietly. Cecily sat with her in the mornings and read to her, and brought up the tisanes the cook made. Actual tisanes this time, with honey and dried rosehip, and in the afternoons she walked in the grounds for the half-hour of air that the day permitted before the cold drove her back in. On the 3rd afternoon he fell into step beside her. She had not heard him cross the gravel. She said, "My lord." "Your wife is improving. I expect she will be well enough for the drawing-room by Saturday." He said, "I know." He said, "Margaret told me you have been sitting with her until she falls asleep." Cecily said she finds it restful. He said she finds you restful. He said, "I have observed that you are not restful with most people." She said, "I am not certain whether that is a compliment." He said, "It is an observation." They walked for a moment without speaking. The grounds were gray and cold and the bare trees stood against a white sky, and the stone of the east wing was the color of chalk in the flat light. He said, "Miss Vane, I am going to ask you something, and I would like a plain answer." She said, "Yes, my lord." He said, "Are you happy here?" She stopped walking. It was not a question she had been asked in a great number of years, and it landed with the weight of a question that had not been in common circulation. She said carefully, "I am more useful here than I have been in some time. I find the position well suited to my abilities." He said, "That is not what I asked." She looked at him. He was watching her with those gray eyes that catalogued and retained, and she was aware, quite suddenly, and quite precisely, that he was asking the question as someone who intended to act on the answer. She said, "Yes, I am happy here." She said it simply, because it was true. He said, "Good." He said, "I want you to remain." She said, "I intend to remain." He said, "I mean for the long term." He paused, and then he said, "I have spoken with Margaret." The world rearranged itself very slightly around that sentence. She kept her face level. She said, "Lord Ashmore," he said, "we have talked a good deal, Margaret and I, since Christmas." He said it without performance, in the plain manner he had for important things. He said, "We understand one another better than we did in November. I believe we have arrived at a genuine honesty." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "She knows what I am going to say now. She was the one who suggested I say it plainly, rather than in the oblique manner I had planned." Cecily said, "Your wife is a wise woman." He said, "She is." He looked at the bare trees. He said, "You came here to do harm, and you chose not to. You have been here for 3 months, and in those 3 months, you have done what I could not quite do alone, which is, make my wife feel that this house is hers." He said, "I am grateful for that beyond my ability to express it." He said, "And I am asking you to understand that gratitude is not the only thing I am speaking from." The cold air was very still. Somewhere beyond the east wing a horse moved in its stall, and the sound carried a long way in the silence. She said, "You are asking me something you cannot ask me." He said, "I am not asking you anything improper. I am asking you to know a thing that is true, and to let it be true without our having to perform as though it is not." He said, "You are part of this household. That is all I am saying. Whatever that means, in time, and in whatever shape it can be given, you are part of it." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I understand." He said, "Good." He did not say anything else. 1p. They turned and walked back toward the house, the gravel under their feet and the cold sky above and the gray stone rising ahead of them. And she did not take his arm because that would not have been right, and he did not offer it because he understood the shape of what was right. And they went inside. Lady Ashmore was awake when Cecily brought up the afternoon tisane. She looked at her over the edge of the cup with those kind eyes, and she said, "James spoke with you." Cecily said, "He did." Lady Ashmore said, "And?" Cecily said, "And I told him I intend to remain." Lady Ashmore said, "Good." She drank her tisane. She said, "I have had a letter from the botanist in Edinburgh. He has agreed to send cuttings in April." She said, "I think the kitchen garden is going to be rather exceptional by summer." Cecily said, "I think so too." She went to the window. Outside, the last of the afternoon light was going, and the grounds lay pale and quiet under a sky that had the particular blue of late winter, the color of a thing almost finished with being cold. She thought about the dressing room in December. She thought about the vial cold in her palm. She thought about the moment of choice, which had not felt like a choice, when she was in it but had felt like the only true thing she had done in a very long time. She had arrived at Ashmore Park with 30 guineas and a commission, and a private assessment of herself as a woman without alternatives. She had left none of those things behind by refusing the commission. She had no reference. She had spent the money. She had no name in the season and no expectation of one. What she had was the window and the garden beyond it, and the sound of Lady Ashmore unfolding the Edinburgh letter with a quick, rustling pleasure, and his footstep in the corridor below, which she recognized without looking, which she would always recognize, which was a fact. She had made her peace with in the way one made peace with facts one could not alter, and did not wish to, the companion and nothing more, who had been nothing more, and had chosen to be something else. She turned from the window. Thank you for staying with Cecily all the way to the end of her story. If her choice moved you, leave a thought below. The letter from the botanist in Edinburgh was set on the writing desk. The fire was low and needed building. Lady Ashmore had fallen asleep with the letter still in her hand, and outside the last light was gone, and the grounds were blue and quiet in the dusk, and somewhere in the garden, beneath the frozen soil, the things she had planted were waiting for spring to tell them what they were. Cecily put another log on the fire. She sat down. She picked up her book. The house settled around her, as houses do when they have found their shape.